Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. I've got some reference studies on clothing and also poses for you today. So most of the art that I do tends to be portraits that never really go below the waist, and even when I do full body poses, I'll normally hide the legs with skirts or something. I feel like full body artworks is something I've always struggled with, and a lot of my earlier attempts over the years have always looked so stiff, and I've always just given up and focused on other things like faces and lighting, etc. Now that I'm happier though with how my portraits look, I think it's time I started trying to improve in other areas. I chose some references that will force me to actually draw legs and also work on my ability to draw clothing, because a lot of my older drawings of clothing have looked a bit like molded plastic rather than taking into account folds and how they actually drape over the human body. You can check out my last video about my digital art progress if you want to see what that looked like. I don't really count armor because even though it technically is clothing, it is basically just metal and it's not dynamic. I hope that makes sense. I feel like the aspect of clothing that I struggle with the most is specifically how it changes with movement and fits over the body. I've been looking at other artists' artwork and I think this is an area that I really need to work on, especially if I want to get better at character art for my own stories and stuff. I'll admit that the first reference is something that has been in an open do this later tab on my computer for maybe the last 6 months. I decided I actually had to clear some tabs out by either doing the thing or closing the tab, and I didn't want to close it because then I'd forget about it forever, so now I only have about 30 tabs open instead of 31. I specifically chose this reference because I like the bright colours of the clothes and interesting folds, but also mainly because it was just a simple standing pose. For some reason I actually find it harder to do a static standing pose compared to ones where they're running or whatever. I don't know if anyone else feels the same way. I think maybe it's because the character isn't actively moving, which makes it so easy for the whole thing to just look extremely stiff, which has always been my biggest issue, though maybe it just means I need to do more practice. I'm also fully embracing my hatred of line art now. Well, I suppose I don't totally hate it, but for my overall drawing style it's just a total waste of time because I have a more painterly style, and whenever I've previously had line art I've always had to include the extra step of rendering it out and blending it in, so now I've just cut that bit out entirely, which makes my whole painting process faster. I was happy with how it turned out overall. It didn't feel as stiff as how I normally draw static standing poses, and I think the reason for that is because even though he's standing straight, his hips and shoulders are tilted, which still makes the pose dynamic, and also is technically how people would normally position themselves when standing to maintain balance and centre of mass. I probably could have worked on it more to make it look better, especially with the face and hands, but I simply reached my limit for how long I was willing to spend on this drawing, so I decided to move on rather than forcing myself to keep working on it and getting bored, especially since I wanted to do a couple of studies to make an aesthetic spread like in my other video where I was practicing drawing more armour. That's probably the difference between someone like me who is more of a hobby artist than a professional artist though, to be honest. Most of the artwork I see from professionals have this finished, polished quality, which I feel like a lot of my art doesn't have, but it's okay because I feel that as I get better at art I'll get faster and I'll be able to achieve the more finished look quicker, because currently it's just outside my time limit for how long I'm willing to spend on an art piece, because I just have so much I want to draw. I don't want to waste too much time on a single thing. I really like the reference I used for the second study because it reminded me of Rapunzel with the purple and the long hair with flowers, though I ended up making the clothes look more pink than purple, to be honest. I've seen a lot of concept art online from other artists I follow who've done like a South Asian Rapunzel, which I thought was so pretty, and it basically reminded me of those. I'd say Tangled is probably one of my favourite Disney movies, and I've heard they're planning on doing a live action version. I don't know if I'd bother watching it though, because I find the whole concept of constantly doing live action remakes instead of creating new and good original stories to be really annoying. Like, they don't even have to be original stories, it could just be another fairy tale we haven't seen yet, like The Princess and the Pea or something. Though if I'm being honest, even if they did do that, I still wouldn't voluntarily give my money to the evil mouse corporation, so ultimately it doesn't really matter what I think. Tangent aside though, the second reference was really good for practicing folds, because saris are basically just a single large piece of fabric that's draped and folded over the body to create a nice silhouette. I think I did end up getting a bit too caught up with drawing the face though instead of the clothes, because her face was angled slightly in the reference and I didn't manage to quite capture that, but you know what, it's just something to work on another time. Unfortunately, because I spent so long trying to get the angle of the face right, I ended up getting a bit tired of drawing so many folds of the clothes, so I just tried to clean it as best I could and then move on to the next one. I didn't follow the reference exactly, but I do think I got a bit overwhelmed with all the folds and trying to match the reference, which was why I got a bit fed up. My process, like I mentioned in my how to study from references video, is to block the big shapes and folds and then slowly refine them. So I started out by putting in random dark folds where they roughly matched on the reference, then building on that and adding darker shadows for ambient ambient occlusion, etc. I used a confetti brush to imitate the gold trimmings on the edges because I couldn't be bothered to draw out the intricate patterns. I feel like I'm not actually setting a very good example, you know. Half of my videos are just me saying I couldn't be bothered to do this one thing, so I did this other thing as a shortcut and decided to call it a day. Maybe if I decided to focus on a few more specific folds and smooth the rest out, I would have gotten less fed up, even if it ended up being even less accurate to the reference. It was specifically a load of micro folds on her arms which I got tired of drawing, but you know what, it is what it is. I'm still mostly happy with how it looks, and if art is supposed to be fun, what is the point in forcing myself to keep going when it stops being fun? Plus, I did go back a little later after finishing the other drawings to add some extra details like highlights. For the third drawing, I think the reference may have originally been from a Japanese clothing catalogue, same as the first reference as well actually. At this point I was starting to feel tired of doing the studies and wanted to go draw something else, but like I said before, my goal was to have an aesthetic spread of studies like you sometimes see on Instagram in sketchbooks, so I forced myself to keep going. Man, I'm such a hypocrite. I literally just finished talking about not forcing yourself to keep going when you don't want to, but you know what, I didn't create this channel to give sage art advice, okay? I made it so I could post my painting processes and then also ramble about random art stuff I'm doing. Plus, it's about balance. If I quit halfway through every drawing, I'll never get anything done, so I have to pick my battles, you know? Yeah. I probably should have just said that from the start, but like I said, I'm not an art guru. If you want coherent art advice, go watch Marco Bucci. I remember I was actually getting so fed up with the studies and thinking to myself that maybe I should just stop and release them as separate videos, but I wanted to keep them all together and also get used to actually finishing stuff. I did take some shortcuts though, like the model's shoes and hands. Basically, I was like, these are not the focus of this study and therefore I do not care. Like I said, balance. Anyway, I basically just put down the basic pose and colours before starting the last study, so they were all on the same page, because I knew if I waited until I finished the third one, I would fully give up before starting the last one and it would leave an ugly gap on the canvas. I had to do a bit of searching for a reference that would fit into the remaining gap and also would let me properly practice clothing and folds, and I think I picked a good one actually. The clothing itself was a bit boring, but because the model was sitting cross-legged, it created some interesting folds to practice. I think the deep shadows for the ambient occlusion is what brought the whole thing together. I pretty much did the same thing as I did for the second drawing in terms of putting down shapes with folds that weren't too dark and then going over them with darker colours to make them more defined. Even though I was getting a bit annoyed at doing the studies, I also feel like I still did enjoy doing them. I think part of it was the satisfaction of finally doing the studies I said I was going to do for months, but also drawing folds was kind of fun. It was definitely easier for me this time round compared to other times I've tried to draw clothes. I think it may have also been the modern aspect of the clothes that I was getting bored of. If you look back at my previous drawings / videos, you'll see that I definitely gravitate more towards fantastical / fancy clothing rather than everyday modern clothes, but ultimately I felt it was important to do these studies of regular clothes as well because they're simpler and will provide a base for me to eventually get better at drawing more complex clothes as well. I just have so many things I want to work on, but not always the time and motivation to work on them, unfortunately. Well, ultimately I guess I'll just have to keep doing what I can when I can. One thing I did take a shortcut on for the third drawing though was mimicking how the striped pattern of the shirt looks over folds. I think that's quite hard, keeping a consistent clothing pattern over folds, but I'll have to dedicate a separate study to something like that because again, it's like how I mentioned in my how to study from references video, it's not good to take on too many challenging things at once. I really did like how they all turned out in the end though, especially the third study. That one was definitely my favourite and I'm glad I stuck with them all. I specifically enjoyed drawing her hair flowing all over the place even though the focus was supposed to be on her clothes. Of course, drawing clothing and folds is all fine when the models are in studio lighting and stuff, but I think drawing clothing and how it interacts with lighting and the environment would be a challenge for me, specifically with full body figures. I think part of the reason why I always draw portraits and only the face / top part of the body is because it means I don't need to think about drawing the background and environment and how they interact with the characters. I have tried to draw big scenes before, but it's been really hard for me to make them look good the way I want them to, so I've been targeting individual aspects in the hope that I'll eventually be good enough at them to put them all together. But equally, I think it is important for me to just go for it because studies are all well and good, but I think I've always had the most fun learning as I go along when I draw my own original artworks, and I'm less likely to get bored when I'm drawing stuff from my own imagination. At least I think so. I could be wrong. Does anyone truly know themselves? Yeah, anyway, I have a lot of different ideas for videos that I want to make in future, but I haven't decided what I'll actually do next, especially because some may take a while. So stay tuned for more art videos. Thanks for watching.